Mr. President, while I have the floor, I want to speak today about a growing crisis at our southern border. We're told that next week we're actually going to vote on a funding package, an appropriation package to fund humanitarian aid for the southern border. Recently, a colleague of mine, Senator Steve Daines from Montana, and I traveled down to the McAllen sector of the border in Texas. We went out on patrol overnight with the Customs and Border Patrol agents in the middle of the night. We were out there all night with them and then went on a patrol in the early morning hours, just as dawn broke, on the river. We saw firsthand, we don't just have an illegal immigration problem, Mr. President, we have a national security crisis right there at our southern border. My biggest takeaway was that the drug trafficking down there has risen now to be a full-blown crisis. Between FY97 and FY18, Mr. President, the CBP saw a 22% increase in heroin, 38% increase in meth, and 73% increase in fentanyl seizures. In that year alone, in FY18, Mr. President, enough fentanyl was brought into the country illegally to kill every woman, man, and child in America. The Border Patrol agents we spoke to estimated that they're only able to interdict between 7 and 10%, however, of the drugs actually crossing the border in the McAllen sector. Mr. President, that is a crisis, if no other reason we have a crisis. In addition, the amount of human traffic we're seeing at the border is unprecedented. Last month alone, 144,000 individuals were apprehended at our southern border. This is the highest number of apprehensions in over 13 years, Mr. President. In just the first 8 months of the fiscal year, 411,000 unaccompanied children and family units were apprehended at our southern border, including 84,000 family units and 11,000 unaccompanied children just last month. Mr. President, 11,000 unaccompanied children. How does an unaccompanied child get all the way from Honduras or Guatemala to our border? Mr. President, this is a conspiracy led by the cartels. I've seen it firsthand. We heard the gunfire across the river the night we were on patrol. It's real. If this trend continues, 800,000 children and families could be apprehended at the southern border by the end of this fiscal year alone. To put that in perspective, Mr. President, we issue 1,100,000 legal green cards a year. That's a pathway to citizenship. And this year alone, just the family units alone could be 800,000 people apprehended at the southern border. Clearly, our Border Patrol agents are overwhelmed. When an unaccompanied child arrives at the border, they're cared for by Border Patrol agents until they can be placed in the care of the Department of Health and Human Services. However, the number of children arriving today greatly exceeds HHS capacity to deal with. As of last week, 1,900 unaccompanied children were in CBP custody awaiting placement in HHS care. But Health and Human Services had less than 700 beds in which to place them, Mr. President. Now, according to the Department of Homeland Security, Border Patrol agents are spending more than half their time caring for families and children, providing medical assistance, driving buses, and acting as food service workers instead of performing law enforcement duties. Pulling Border Patrol agents away from their law enforcement duties only exacerbates the crisis at the border, Mr. President. We saw that firsthand on our overnight patrols. The acting commissioner of CBP said recently, "We're in a full-blown emergency, and I cannot say this any stronger. The system is broken," unquote. On May 1st, the Trump administration requested $4.5 billion in funds to help address the growing crisis at the border. At the time, we were debating disaster relief for my home state of Georgia and a dozen other states across the country. On May 23rd, President Trump broke the logjam and agreed to separate border humanitarian aid from the disaster relief question, and it allowed us then, within hours, on this floor to pass the disaster relief bill. Now we have to do the same thing for this humanitarian aid at the border. Meanwhile, the humanitarian crisis at the southern border has only continued to escalate, and we have to do something about it right now. This week, Health and Human Services and the Department of Homeland Security sent a letter to every member of Congress. It said, absent an emergency appropriation, we anticipate running out of funding as soon as later this month. The Department of Homeland Security has already started pulling resources away from critical missions in order to try and keep up with this surge of human traffic. Without additional funds by August, the Department of Homeland Security says they will have to redirect manpower and funding from TSA, FEMA, and the Coast Guard in order to address the crisis at the border. The acting director of ICE just recently said, quote, "We're begging, we're asking Congress to please help us now," end quote. This should not be a political issue, Mr. President. I'm hoping that it won't be. This is about giving federal agents the resources they need to care for children and families in their custody and respond to this crisis situation. Even the New York Times editorial board said, and I quote, "Congress, give Trump his border money," end quote. That's the New York Times, Mr. President. Not a big fan of our president. The Senate will vote on this emergency funding next week, and I hope it will receive bipartisan support. It absolutely should. Going forward, we have to address the underlying cause of this crisis, however. Since 2014, the number of unaccompanied children and family units arriving at the southern border has skyrocketed because of loopholes in our asylum and immigration laws. Minors and family units can easily assert broad and unspecific asylum claims. Then they're released into the United States, Mr. President, while they await formal removal proceedings, which could be months or years down the road. These loopholes, combined with programs like the DACA program, have led to a staggering increase in the number of unaccompanied children and family units arriving at our border. Oftentimes, these kids and families are exploited by cartels on their journey to the United States and are in dire need of human services by the time they get here. It's truly heartbreaking what some of these people go through. These cartels profit off the most vulnerable. They fuel the drug trade and endanger communities across our country, and indeed the world for that matter. We've got to put the cartels out of business, Mr. President. We have to close these loopholes and encourage illegal immigration into our country. And finally, we have got to give the Border Patrol officers the tools they need to do their jobs and protect our country. This means more technology, more personnel, and more barriers. In conclusion, I want to say thank you to the women and men who protect our border. Their job isn't easy. But I will say this today, the best, and I mean the very best, is in our military uniforms around the world doing our business, and our Border Patrol people who are protecting our border every day and night on our southern border here in the United States. We appreciate what you all do. God bless you. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.